So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kat. I'm the events manager here at Actevate. Welcome to our webinar. This is one of our series of webinars with Robert Migliore. So Rob is the founder and director at Actevate, and he'll be facilitating this workshop. For those of you who don't know too much about Actevate, we're passionate about helping organisations create physically and mentally safe workplaces. And today we're going to be focusing on the mental health side of things. So we've got a couple of speakers for you today. We've got our psychological services lead, Edwina Wong, and she'll be speaking to you about the latest data and trends and her insights on, sorry, just admit some people, and her insights on why there has been such a big increase in people seeking for help. We're also going to have Dr. Giuseppe Carabetta join us halfway through the webinar. So Dr. Carabetta is a lecturer at the University of Sydney. He's got a doctorate in law, and he'll be talking to us about vaccine mandates and the legalities around mental health for employers, and much more as well. So we're looking forward to having him join. Please note that everything Giuseppe shares with us will be his opinions and insights as a doctorate of law, but it's not to be taken as legal advice. So we've got another one joining. One sec. Here we are. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll pass, before I do actually, I just wanted to say as well, we're going to have a quick Q&A section after Edwina speaks, and again after Dr. Carabetta speaks. But if you have any burning questions in the meantime, please just pop up under the reactions, the raise hand emoji, and we can pause to take your question, or you can feel free to pop it in the chat box, and I'll save that so we can bring it up in the Q&A section as well. Okay, so I'm going to pass you over to Rob now and Edwina. Take it away, Rob.
Thanks very much, Kat, for the introduction, and welcome to the first of our webinar series for 2022. It was a little bit of a late start for us. Lots of movement happening with the government making changes to vaccine mandate laws, and also the opening up of workplaces to people coming back. So that is the thrust of today's session. We want to talk about this phenomenon of how our mental health has been impacted by the pandemic, what it means for us returning to the office. I know that Actevate has returned to the office, and we're in a hybrid model of some people continuing to work from home, but mostly we are in the office. This is not the case for a lot of other organisations who are still largely working from home. Edwina today is going to start us off by talking about her team and what their experiences have been in the servicing of our EAP contracts, looking at the mental health issues that are being shared in those sessions, those very private and confidential sessions. And so it's a very unique insight that we'll have today into what people are bringing to those sessions, what is causing them the distress, the anguish and the upset, and what are they finding challenging in their daily working and personal lives. So Edwina will be sharing our own data as well as some of the latest data pointing towards the mental health pathway. So over to you, Edwina.
Thank you, Rob. So let me quickly share my slides. Bear with me for just a moment. Please let me know if you can't see my slides. But by way of introduction, as Kat and Robin mentioned, I'm Edwina. I'm the psychological services lead at Actevate. I've been in the psychological space for about 2 years, and prior to that, a number of years in HR and industries. I've been kind of previously have a reputation for being really demanding and fast-paced, so banking, law, and so the intersection between mental health and the workplace is something that I find super, super interesting. So thank you so much for joining me today as I'm sharing some of the current and emerging trends that we're seeing, both my team and I. In terms of my segment, we'll be looking at trends that you've probably seen as well, so things that are very much in the public sphere, the latest statistics, and then I'll share some insights just around the data points that we're seeing on the EAP space as well. So what we've seen, and you might have seen this come across your desk in different articles, but firstly, collective shared experiences. I think not many, if any, individuals would argue with the fact that we've had a pretty turbulent last 2 or 3 years, one marked with significant uncertainty. And with that collective experience that everyone's experiencing, there's also this traveling through what we would call like a collective grief almost, because grief is not only something you would apply to when someone passes away, but it could also be grieving over a sense of normality, a sense of livelihood, our career, our identities. And that's certainly something we've observed in the last few years. This brings me on to my next point around languishing. You may certainly have heard this term as it's kind of come back through to the surface. Recently published by the psychologist Adam Grant. And it's this idea where languishing kind of sits between the spectrum of mental health, where you're not necessarily depressed or burnt out, but at the same time, you're not flourishing either. You're not actively seeking joy. You're not getting out of bed, springing out. And there's, for lack of a better word, a real sense of meh. And it's really interesting because I think it's certainly really relevant in this context where with the global pandemic, it's this really quite protracted experience, this long emotional overhaul where maybe 2 or 3 years ago, it started as this acute response to threat, where we immediately started putting in actions responding to something that we found threatening, whether that's hoarding toilet paper, mask mandates, putting in isolation kind of restrictions. There was a real sense of action and doing. But as the pandemic became more and more extended, we then go through this languishing feeling because we've been surviving for so long. And that's certainly something we see in our counseling sessions as well, where a lot of our clients are not necessarily presenting with very severe symptoms, but a good portion of them had almost a subclinical presentation where I think there was a sense of just being unable to cope with things that may have been perfectly fine in the past, but probably reflecting that for a lot of us, our cups were empty and we weren't able to continue pouring from it. The next thing I wanted to speak about is something I find really, really interesting and exciting is this democratizing of therapy speak. And what do I mean by that? Therapy speak is language that typically you would only hear in a psychological session. So increasingly, myself and my team, we're finding that our clients are entering sessions already with a pretty clear idea of what they're hoping to achieve. They're using language like, I'd like to unpack this. I'd like to identify these particular triggers. I think I'm experiencing cognitive dissonance. And if you're on social media, certainly there's so much available information, and increasingly we're seeing individuals and employees, what I find really encouraging is that they're becoming more empowered about this. They are wanting to learn more about their mental health. They're wanting to kind of recover and look after their mental health with the same level of importance as they would with their physical health. And so I find that really, really encouraging and exciting. I guess similarly, how that would apply for employers is increasingly, I think there'll be more and more conversations about mental health. And so I think the mantle for employers and managers is being prepared to have those conversations and being prepared to respond to have those conversations, which is why it's so useful to have services such as providing employees with mental health awareness training or even mental health first aid training, just so that you can encourage and facilitate this particular dialogue at work. I then move on to looking at some of our key statistics, which I'm really excited about, and apologies for my level of excitement. this was released not so long ago. The Australian Bureau of Statistics completed a national study of mental health and well-being over the last 2 years. And so this was only recently released as a bit of a teaser. We're expecting a broader study to be released next month. But I've included a few of my favorite statistics I found really particularly interesting. The first being 15% of Australians in the last 2 years, so across 2020, 2021, experienced high to very high levels of psychological distress. And I think considering the level of uncertainty facing most people, it's certainly understandable why we're seeing this level of psychological distress. I haven't mentioned it on this particular slide, but we also see previous patterns that were established emerging in the study as well, particularly around gender differences. So 19% of the females in the study reported high to very high levels of psychological distress, and this is compared to 12% for males. And there's a number of different reasons, whether it's typically females exhibit more help-seeking behavior, or perhaps societal pressures for males to be more stoic about their mental health experience. But again, we're seeing that pattern emerging as well. I then move on to 1 in 5 young Australians aged 16 to 34 in the last 2 years experienced high or very high levels of psychological distress. And this is certainly really understandable with the unique experiences facing them in the last 2 years, with young people working in industries predominantly affected by COVID, whether it's hospitality, retail. I think a lot of their livelihood in certain settings, such as schooling and high school, university, at work, that was impacted as well. Their avenues for socializing have been restricted. And so it's really understandable that we're seeing quite a high number here. And it's interesting to know as well, compared to older Australians aged 65 to 85, it's almost double this rate, where for those older Australians, I believe that demographic had 9% experiencing that same level of psychological distress. The next statistic is that 17% of Australians in the last 2 years saw a health professional for their mental health. And I find this really encouraging again, because I see it again as Australians now treating their mental health with the same level of seriousness and urgency as they would with their physical health. To break the statistic down further, I believe of the 17%, 12% of them sought out assistance from their GP, whilst 8% reached out to a psychologist. And my final statistic here is that 15% of Australians reported feeling lonely in the last 4 weeks. And so just as we have this global pandemic in front of us, I think running parallel to that, as well as something that has been previously observed being the loneliness epidemic. I think certainly for individuals living alone or not in a relationship, that kind of epidemic has been magnified within the global pandemic, when you might be required to isolate alone. And even if not an individual or not in a relationship, I think certainly being separated from your families, having to find creative and new ways of keeping in touch with them, whether that's through FaceTime, Zoom, and doing weekly trivia online. It's having to be creative, but at the same time, probably not a full substitute for face-to-face quality interactions as well. I then move on to what we've found in our EAP space. So as Rob mentioned, myself and my team, we provide EAP counseling services for our corporate clients. And what that means is that we provide those organizations and their employees access to confidential counseling at no cost to the employee or the manager. We have a similar program for managers, and they're able to bring to the table whatever they find interesting or concerning, and we unpack it over the sessions. What we found, and I'll go through each of these headings in more detail, is an increased utilization of our EAP service, a real prevalence of anxiety. Our clients are reaching out for support for personal reasons, and then a continuation of need for ongoing support planning as well. So when I say increased EAP utilization, we measured this by looking at our data sets from the last 6 months compared to the 6 months before that. And what we found was that there was a 23% increase in the number of clients reaching out for EAP support. And on the other hand, what we also found was that there was a 42% increase in the number of EAP sessions that our team provided. And I think this certainly folds into the broader trend that we're seeing, where there's a real increase in high demand for psychological support. What we're finding is that a lot of psychologists have had to close their books for new referrals. They just simply don't have capacity to accept new referrals, or if they are, there are pretty substantive waiting times to see the psychologist. And I certainly think this broader trend is a contributing factor for why we're seeing an increased demand for support. The next slide is around the prevalence of anxiety. And so with our EAP sessions, it starts off by a counselor asking our clients, what did you present today? What would you like to discuss? And we found that in the last 6 months, 24% of our clients reached out as they perceived that they were experiencing anxiety. And similarly, of our clients in the last 6 months, we perceived and observed that 42% of our clients, we observed symptoms of anxiety as well. So whilst a client might be presenting for a number of different reasons, we found that the primary symptom that we were observing within our sessions was anxiety. And as a consequence of the anxiety, the leading impact of function was that it was affecting their moods. For example, they might be feeling more irritable, feeling low, more frustrated, or feelings of fear. And those are some of the things that we were observing in our sessions. I suppose in terms of why the anxiety, a number of different reasons. Something that was interesting was that towards the end of last year, we saw a real spike in clients presenting with anxiety in relation to various mandates, whether that's vaccine mandates or return to work mandates. A lot of clients had presented with anxiety around a fear of losing their voice, loss of freedom, a real concern for what's going to be happening in the future. And that was something that we heard quite a bit. In terms of the return to work mandates with different employers, I think there was a requirement when we were all isolating at home to adjust to a new normal. And then with the mandates, there was a requirement to adjust to the old but slightly different normal. And this was particularly impactful for any individuals that may have found it particularly beneficial to be working from home. For example, fathers who had worked from home and found more opportunity to be spending time with their families, assisting with the housework. And we found a trend of them being particularly anxious about returning to work and relinquishing that level of flexibility. Another area around contributing to anxiety that we've seen is probably just uncertainty around the economy. I think certainly there was a period where a lot of organizations and companies were shuttering, they weren't surviving the pandemic. There was a real sense of uncertainty around like job security and whether your jobs were secure, or if you were going to be given shifts, whether you'd be stood down. And there was a real sense of concern around whether someone's job was secure, they were going to be able to provide for their family on a week-to-week, fortnightly basis. The final area I would say is around relationships. So with this first statistics, the primary reason for people reaching out was anxiety, but the second highest reason was actually for relationship reasons. And that was, I think, 20% of our clients. And I think that was certainly interlinked with anxiety as well. With the pandemic, I think a lot of couples spent above normal and expected amounts of time together in close proximity. I think certainly that's fertile ground potentially for increased conflict between the two. And some of that conflict that we saw in our different sessions include the negotiation between partners around the delineation and allocation of housework. We also see parents kind of struggling through that as well, particularly around with mothers who have had to wear several hats, being a mother, being employed, and also being on occasion a backup support teacher as well. Those are some of the key pieces that we saw. And so, yeah, that's anxiety that as we saw it in the last 6 months. And then finally, or maybe not finally, the second last statistic is around seeking support for personal reasons. I think there's a very common myth that EAP services can only be accessed for work reasons, whether that's performance issues or challenging conversations or like conflict with your colleagues, but that's certainly untrue. We welcome anything that might be causing distress to our clients, and that's shown in the statistic. Specifically, 60% of our clients reached out for personal reasons or a mix of personal and work reasons. And my final statistic is just around ongoing support planning. We found that almost 20% of our clients, so 18% of our clients, our team supported 18% of them with organizing a mental health care plan through their GP and via Medicare. And again, I think that really speaks to really great demand for psychological support that we're seeing. And it's great to see that we're able to support our clients through that. What that looks like is at the end of all of our sessions, we do a bit of future planning with our clients and try to get an understanding of how they're placed. Are they happy kind of road testing the different strategies that we've gone through in the sessions, or whether they'd like ongoing support with an external psychologist. And if that's something they've indicated as something that would be helpful for them, then we provide them with a letter of recommendation to take to the GP. And so those are some of the key statistics that I found particularly interesting. Happy to address any questions. I'd love to hear any anecdotes from the audience as well, whether they found that to be certainly relevant in their particular spaces, workspaces. And yeah, thank you. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Edwina, for sharing those insights. I have to say I was also quite surprised to learn that many people were actually coming for relationship reasons. There is that myth that you've since dispelled about people choosing to help seek because their issues are work related, but what you said was often there was a number of issues that they were coming to. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you tease that out in a session? And is it your role as a psychologist to try and identify what the most dominant issue is and unpack that, or do you sometimes have to do a lot of unpacking of various issues?
I think it would certainly vary from client to client. With our EAP sessions, we always let them, by way of content, we always allow our clients to drive what they would like to speak about. We want to ensure that it's relevant for them. So during our first session, the initial kind of intake, we ask, what would you like to talk about? And at the end of the session, we go about planning for our remaining sessions. This is probably what it's going to look like. Does that seem like that's something that's going to be beneficial and helpful for you? But as I think previous experience shows, it doesn't always follow that kind of specified roadmap. I think as you have conversations with your clients, something else comes up, and then so you do take a little bit of a tangent as well, because I think with our mental health, it's so interrelated. You might be speaking about struggling in the workplace, but then we always take a holistic approach and say, well, what else is on your plate? And so we end up kind of exploring a number of different domains as a result. Yeah.
Okay. And can you tell us a little bit more about people who were presenting with issues regarding vaccine mandates and their belief systems about vaccine? I know that you shared that with me yesterday when we talked about this session. Were there any statistics that sort of you collected in relation to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly for a period, maybe of a month, the large majority of our new referrals, was in relation to this anxiety around vaccine mandates, return to work mandates. I think looking back in the last 6 months, probably 13% of our new referrals approximately were in relation to that anxiety, COVID mandates and vaccine mandates. And I'm really interested to hear Dr. Carabetta's kind of insights around that as well, like what's landed, what hasn't landed. Yeah,
it'll be very interesting to get his insights on that as well. Before we go over to him and get him to share some of the insights, I know he's having difficulty getting into the session, and he just sent me a message to say he's rebooting his computer. So we have the luxury of a little bit of extra time before he comes on to showtime. And this is a great opportunity for some members of the audience to ask a question. Now, you don't have to necessarily ask it in person. You can use the chat box. If anyone has a question, this is a great opportunity to ask Edwina. And I have one more question, and that is, a lot of our customers who have never had an EAP service before say, why are we having to pay for sometimes 6 sessions with someone? That's going to cost our organisation a lot of money. What is it that you guys do that a psychologist in the field, in a local area couldn't do? Can you explain how your service is more about really empowering that person to be more effective in the workplace as opposed to just in their personal lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think where a client presents for concerns in the workplace, they do it at a junction point when I think these issues are either something that they want to preempt or it's particularly significant, but they're also faced with a reality where they can't immediately access psychological support with an external psychologist, or it might take a period to organize a mental health care plan, or there might be kind of wait listings that they're kind of faced with. And so certainly with the EAP sessions, we do a lot of work in looking at how an individual can go about managing various workplace issues, to the extent where you could be looking at exploring communication styles, exploring conflict between colleagues, and really providing them with strategies to go about navigating a workplace that might be causing them anxiety, whereas looking at, for example, different strategies around grounding if it's anxiety. And I think by going through those different sessions, I think you can go about preempting certain outcomes where if the employee hadn't sought out EAP, it might lead to extended absences. It might lead to a workers' compensation claim. It might lead to resignations. And I think providing them that support on the immediate term, it has such a powerful, I guess, opportunity of preempting certain outcomes that can become even more costly to an employer, whether that's workers' compensation claims, increasing premiums, the cost of attrition and recruitment, potentially like disciplinary processes that could go public. And that's why I see there's like a little bit of value there in terms of EAP services.
We have a question from Inga in relation to statistics and how they vary from previous years. Can you see that question, Edwina?
Bear with me for just a second. How does statistics vary from previous years? Bear with me just a second. How does statistics vary from previous years? You're talking about what? Sure. In previous years, it was also anxiety, but there was also some different secondary reasons as well. We saw a mix of concerns around incidences at the workplace. It could be still relationships as well. But I think there was still, the front runner was still anxiety. Yeah, when I looked at the last 6 months prior to the current 6 months.
Okay, and there's another question there as well. How many sessions does the EAP cover per year?
It would really depend on client to client. You could offer, in some settings, we offer 3 sessions per client. With other employers, we might offer up to 6. With each client, there is room to potentially seek approval for an extension of the service, where you might request a few additional services if potentially there's a need to provide the client support in the interim, for example, when they're seeking a mental health support plan, and then we can bridge that gap between them seeing a psychologist in the meantime, or if there's a particularly significant presentation that we could provide support on in the meantime. So the answer is kind of, it depends.
Okay, great. Well, we've got the man in the house now. Dr. Carabetta has joined us, and thank you for joining us. He has had quite a lot of engagement since the election has passed. Obviously, there's great interest in workplace laws and whether there may be changes the Labor government will look to implement in the wake of their success. But we wanted Dr. Carabetta to talk to us about what he talked to us about in October last year, and that was at that point we were looking at, well, what's going to happen when people do get back to work? And it was right about the time that vaccine mandates were a hot topic, and certainly Qantas got a lot of interest at the time for their stance, and Dr. Carabetta had written many articles in relation to that and appeared on various news channels. Can you tell us, Dr. Carabetta, what where we're up to now in relationship to vaccine mandates?
Hi, Rob. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We can indeed, yes.
Okay, I've got, I'm staring at a black screen. I don't know what is going on. This is the first time in 2.5 years I've had Zoom issues. So there you go.
Well, it could have something to do with funding of our university that we lecture at, but let's not talk about that. Let's just get your get your impressions.
Yeah, sure. So I'll speak anecdotally in part. The last time we spoke, I'm not exaggerating, I was getting calls daily. So without naming names, I had a dismissed police officer of 27 years experience. He would call me on the employee side, and then on the employer side, there were regular calls as well. So I ended up, I was just giving a legal prediction, and confusing and also upsetting both sides. But I think Edwina has spoken about the angst on the side of employees. I can tell you a few things. So firstly, absent government health orders, so we had a number of health orders in New South Wales and the other jurisdictions. Some of those were challenged, many of them were challenged on various grounds, some quite strange legally, but people were quite upset, everyone from teachers to builders, etc. in New South Wales, certain teachers, certain builders. And generally speaking, those orders were upheld. So it was held that the state government did have power to mandate. Now, one thing that was missed in those conversations by a lot of anxious people was that the health orders, they were time limited. So the government was very careful to put, they actually had to put a time limit. So most of them are not around today, for example. So airport workers and others. Sorry, Christine?
In education, the announcement was made via email from the former Director General that despite the extension not going past May 2022, that they had decided that they would continue that as a condition of employment in schools to protect kids.
Yes, that's New South Wales. Other jurisdictions are taking a different approach. So again, what I'm saying is that many of them, but not all of them, have now ceased. And if the government chooses to go down that track, if there's some, new nasty variant, they'll have to start the process again, basically. That's the government health orders. The other interesting question that I had as an employment law specialist was, can an employer like Qantas, like BHP, like hotels, like restaurants, can they, absent a public health order, impose a policy on the run, if you like? On the run, it was a tricky question, but as long as I predicted that it would be a lawful and reasonable order to do so, at any rate, in client-focused roles. And the full bench of the Commission basically upheld that position in December last year, vis-a-vis a BHP dispute. So BHP had gone it alone, just like some of the banks, just like the hotels, just like some of the others I've mentioned. BHP actually lost the case, but they only lost the case on their duty to consult. So under workplace health and safety law, if you're passing a major policy like that on the run, you need to meaningfully consult. The question was, had they done enough? The answer was no, but they basically then returned to the commission and they got their policy through. So it was upheld. That's the current position. Generally, since then, we've had individual cases for unfair dismissal. Most of those cases have been on, and this relates to you, your fine audience, on medical grounds. And we spoke to Rob about this the other day and to the group about this the other day. And the Fair Work Commission, I'm speaking generally, and again, sorry to sound pedantic, but this is not obviously not legal advice, but the Fair Work Commission has generally been very strict on the meaning of a medical exemption. So they use the science, they use medicos for expert evidence, and they say that unless it is a contraindication, unless it results in a contraindication, Edwina might be able to expand on that. You cannot argue that you're basically being discriminated against, or you basically have a medical exemption. So most of these policies are not blanket policies.
I think we've lost some of your audio there. Are you still with us? Looks like we may have lost Dr. Carabetta momentarily there. In the meantime, we might ask Edwina just to talk a little bit about people's anxiety about coming back to work. So in your practice with your team, were people worried about the possibility that they might not be able to resume work in the physical sense after being at a work from home, in a work from home setting, if they hadn't been vaccinated? Was that a feature of the sessions that you were conducting in your team?
There's certainly a level of anxiety around the ongoing negotiations. I think increasingly, as employers are bringing their workers back into work, some of them had gotten accustomed to that kind of hybrid level of work, where some of it was working remotely, or you could come into the office only one day a week. And so there was a degree of that anxiety of having to come back full-time or part-time, and adjusting to that new normal, learning how to catch a bus again, learning to have a conversation again, re-socializing with all of that. Yeah, absolutely.
I know that prior to this session, we had a question from one of our customers about what we can do in terms of asking the question of someone who might be presenting with a concerning behaviours. So in your discussion as a manager trainer, how do you help managers with that crucial, difficult conversation where they might have to approach someone exhibiting symptoms, let's say anxiety? What's your recommendation about kickstarting a difficult conversation?
I'll try to condense this down as best as I can. I think firstly, it's definitely having an assessment of yourself prior to having the conversation. Are you in a good headspace? Do you have, what's on your plate at the moment? Have you got sufficient time to be hearing out your team member? And then it's certainly being thoughtful and considered about the potential kind of conversation. Have you identified an appropriate time and place for it? And then I think it depends on the employee. You might identify that you might not be the best person to have the conversation. You might not have the right relationship with them. And in that occasion, is it appropriate to pass the baton to somebody else? But in terms of starting that conversation, certainly there's a few different ways you could go about it. Certainly recommend going about it with a soft start, for example. Like I noticed that you've been, for example, you could use an observation. Like I noticed that you haven't been quite as talkative in conversations lately. Just want to check in, is everything okay? As opposed to a hard start, such as, you look terrible, what's going on? Which I think a lot of us have been on the receiving end and have been quite surprised by. And then I guess my final word of advice is just being prepared for the outcomes that the employee may not want to talk about it. And so being prepared to accept that and saying, well, that's completely fine. I do care for you. And if it's okay, I'd like to check in with you 2 weeks time, 1 week time. So yeah, again, I'd love to have gone into it in more detail over 3 hours, but that's probably the highlights reel for having that conversation with an employee. Yeah.
Of course, often an issue regarding one's performance turns up and looks identical to someone having a mental health issue. Is this what you're experiencing in your practice, that you can see that there's a correlation between the presentation of mental health symptoms and someone who may be either having difficulty with their current work or actually being performance managed?
That's a really interesting comment, Rob. Certainly, I think when we're under stress, there's a lot of different symptoms that might suggest we're not performing. Say, for example, there's more conflict between our colleagues, we have difficulty concentrating, our productivity decreases, there's just generally less engagement and motivation. And so whilst these signs individually look like maybe non-performance, I think that's why it's so useful when you're having these serious conversations with your team members to give them the space and floor to say and ask them, like, is everything okay? And giving them that opportunity to share if anything is concerning them psychologically and with regards to their mental health.
Great, okay. Giuseppe, are you back with us now?
For better or for worse, yes.
It sounds like you're back with us now. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really sorry, everyone, but this is honestly very strange. So you can obviously hear me and I can hear you.
That's great. Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay. Not sure where I got to with my long-winded explanation, but I think the final point was that employers can, should they choose to do so, they can actually impose it as a requirement to new appointees. So they can make it a contractual obligation. The evidence on that is still very early days.
Okay. I've got some questions for you that I know are of great interest to those people who are on the webinar. And they have to do with the sort of questions you can ask in a pre-employment capacity. So what is a fair and reasonable request of a candidate? Can we ask them questions about their history regarding their mental health history, whether they have any symptoms at the moment that could impact on their ability to do the job? What are the questions we can ask, and what are the things that we can't ask, and what are the intersecting legislations that are relevant here?
Okay, well, I can come in with certainly with my legal position on all of that, but can I put the question to your audience, because I'm sure that it's something that they have grappled with. I might start it off if it's all right. You certainly,
please.
As a general rule, you cannot say, do you have, to a prospective employee, do you have a mental illness? Absolutely, you're triggering potential discrimination, though I'll get into how difficult that would be to prove, because employers can get away with a lot at that point. They're under no obligation to tell you why you did not get the job. So I've seen some unscrupulous employers who say nothing, or who'll give you another reason. So if you are going to argue, well, look, you know, mental health, it's both protected by the Fair Work Act, it's protected by
Okay. So we've just lost Giuseppe again, and I can see we've got a question from Raj. I'm assuming that was for Dr. Carabetta, is that right?
Not so much, but in terms of the conversation that was just brought up in terms of when it comes to...
Let me just see if he's in the waiting room again and we can pull him back in.
So I'll wait until he comes in back on then.
You can continue with the question, Raj, and then...
So it wasn't so much as a question, is because the part of the industry that I'm with, we deal with this on a day-to-day basis, working with people with disabilities, specifically mental health and employment. But what happens is the minute this question is brought up, people who do have mental health issues or have faced this, the biggest reason they refuse to answer honestly or tell them that there's something wrong, because it comes in as discrimination because it's seen as a sign of weakness, that as soon as I say, yes, there was something wrong with me, I won't get the position, I won't get to the next stage of the interviews, or I won't be interviewed based on a fair go in terms of with a person with non-disability. That is one of the biggest issues that we are facing in our industry when it comes to employment services as well as employment assistance, that people are too scared to voice up and say, hey, there is something wrong. Because and that's where we come in, where we try and work with employers to say, hey, we've got candidates who have got one form or another of disability. It could be mental health, it could be physical, it could be anything across which is classified as having a disability. But that is one of the biggest reasons why candidates who have got some form of barriers refuse to answer that question when they're asked at an interview.
I think we've got Dr. Carabetta back with us now. So, Giuseppe, are you
I suspect somebody is watching this. Some outsider is watching this. We have just some research by some colleagues of mine saying that, and this is going to be a huge issue, that students on Zoom, some of them are being tracked, and there's evidence of that. So, but I don't know what's going on. Just so the question was, what would you do rather than ask that direct question? Remembering that your question has to be, obviously, as an employer, about the actual job. So how do you get around that issue in a lawful and reasonable way?
Yes. So
instead of saying, Rob, do you have a mental illness? What might I ask about? Let's say I was appointing you as a counsellor. What kind of question might I ask?
Well, I think really when you look at this carefully, whether someone has a mental illness or not will not determine whether they can do the job. I think what is really important is to look at the inherent requirements of the job, look at the way the person is managing any condition they have, whether it's diabetes, whether it's depression, anxiety, or any other medical condition. I think what is critical is looking at the demands of the job. That's one aspect. And of course, the other one is that condition being managed appropriately? Now, if it isn't being managed appropriately, then there will be the possibility of that implicating the person's capacity to do their job. It may precipitate an episode of either anxiety or depression or some other psychological condition. And these are the things that we stress when we're doing our pre-employment medicals, that our job is it's not a gotcha moment. It should be an opportunity for that individual to negotiate their current disability, their current mental health issue with their employer. And that's what we encourage in our pre-employment assessments uniquely. We're not there to catch the opposition leader out on knowing whether they have the right policy or not. We're there to actually work with employers and work with individuals that want to get that job. And the more forthcoming they are, and we certainly encourage that.
That's my concern. Some employees may not be, and how do you get around that issue?
Well,
because remember, at the appointment stage, sorry to interrupt you, Rob, at the appointment stage, you don't know. I mean, your fine work gets to this, I suppose, but as an employer on my own, say, I really don't know anything about this person. What if they don't volunteer the information? How do I then accommodate it?
Well, you certainly can't blame them for not volunteering. Yes,
No,
and that's what
absolutely.
you were alluding to earlier. I mean, the thing is, why would you tell an employer
Yep.
in a pre-employment medical with, say, a doctor or a physio or a psychologist that you've got this problem? Because they could very well choose to discriminate against you, unbeknownst to you, as you've suggested,
Absolutely.
and you would be none the wiser. So really, pre-employment screening has a long way to go in order to bridge the gap and giving that individual an opportunity to talk about how they're going to, and they may have already created their own level of reasonable adjustments, reasonable accommodations that make them perfectly employable.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you really need to get that screening and that pre-appointment process right. You have to be elaborate about it. You have to give these opportunities. You have to focus, I think the point I would make is you make the questions about the actual job, which I think is what you're saying.
Okay, Dr. Carabetta just popped up for a second again, but while I'm getting him back in, Raj, did you want to say something about this as well?
Yeah, in terms of basically answering that question or how we would pose that question, it all comes down to the amount of educating it has been done for the employers who are on the hiring side of things. If they can give you an answer in terms of, hey, do you know what disability looks like, rather than just having like back in 2016, every employer that I spoke to as to what disability looks like, for them, it was a person on a wheelchair.
That's right.
Or a person who was physically incapable of doing something for them. But then when you start having these conversations with them, and I think in 2016, the stats were 4 out of 5 people have one form or another of disability. And the definition of it basically means it is something that will stop you from doing your job properly. It could be as simple as wearing glasses. So it is seen as a disability. So if you take your glasses off, obviously you cannot walk to 100% of what you're supposed to be doing. It is an intervention. Your glasses become an intervention that you need to basically fulfill your job role properly. And over the course of time, in terms of the education and stuff we've done with them, then it becomes, the first conversation becomes, okay, how many or what is the percentage of your organization that identify as a person with disability, be it mental health, be it physical, be it whatever. And then based off that conversation is then how you have conversations around, okay, how do we work with someone who's coming in from a disability from the word get-go, the initial screening or the medical stages, up until they start working, and what type of workplace adjustments can be done to this. Like one of the best examples I can give you is Transport for New South Wales. The company that I represent is Disability Services Australia. We are one of the most go-to providers for helping people with disability be part of Transport for New South Wales, which is a governing body. Yes. And the reason we do this is because I think they're working towards a target of having 7% of the entire workforce population with disability. And that is a hard task to fill because they're looking at over 15,000 people. So how do we cater for that? It's basically they send us the job descriptions or the applications as they come through. We filter it, and when we send those applications across, we notify the recruiting agents or the HR personnel, so whoever's looking after them, that hey, we've got X ABC candidates, but please bear in mind they've got 1, 2, 3 things as a barrier. So what happens then is they come back to us saying, hey, we can actually facilitate this in terms of making it easier for them so they don't feel that they've been discriminated against where they lose out on an opportunity.
Yes, what you're talking about is having a diversity and inclusion approach at the pre-employment phase. And this is a very new way of exploring candidature. And,
it is.
And it's very innovative. And it's the approach that we're taking. And look, at the same time, there are many employers also in the disability services space who don't actually want to employ anyone with any disabilities. And so this is the irony of the situation. Whilst you are a disability service provider, you actually are choosing to discriminate against people who present and are openly presenting with disabilities, mental health issues and the like. So we do have a long way to go as an industry in order to cater for the more diverse populations, including those with disabilities, and be more inclusive. I'd like to, we only have a few minutes left, so it might be a good opportunity to give someone else an opportunity to ask a question. So is there anyone else who would like to ask a question, make a comment, or you can also do that in the chat box? Well, in that case,
if I may say something,
sure.
We've got about 26, 27 people on the WebEx here. If anyone needs to know more about diversity and inclusion, please look me up on LinkedIn. I represent that for our company.
That's
so
wonderful.
Basically, in terms of the whole process, recruitment and everything, we work alongside every company we work with. And like I said, we work with the big names in Sydney as well as the small businesses. So there isn't a company that we can't cater for.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us. And I might ask Edwina for her closing comments before we end our session.
Closing comments. Sorry. Certainly something that was
Sorry, I was just going to say, guys, that I actually have Dr. Carabetta. Could you just mute you? I have Dr. Carabetta here on my phone, who just wanted to pop in just to say a few more pointers just before we go on to Edwina's closing statement. If people have another 5 minutes to hang around, we can kind of. He's not going to drop off now because he's on my phone. So, did you?
Wow.
Can you speak, Dr. Carabetta, and make sure everyone can hear you?
Yeah, testing. Hi, everyone. Very sorry. I did try and call you, Kat, and it said that you weren't accepting calls. So it's all happening.
That's interesting.
You know.
Don't know why.
Well, Rob can pay your phone bill, but I'm happy to take questions. So I think I was saying Rob's point.
Pat, your phone, your voice is muted, so we can't hear what Giuseppe's saying. Yes.
Sorry, say that again, Dr. Carabetta, just the last couple of words.
If you have the resources, how's that?
Yeah.
That's good.
As an employer to undertake, scientifically objective employment selection tests and frame the tests around the actual requirements of the job, which is, again, Rob's point about inherent requirements, and I love to hear him speaking like a lawyer. But it's not really a legal question. The question is more of a scientific question or a job analysis question. So what is the actual job about? I've got an incoming call. God. Sorry. And then go from there. And then if you exhaust that process, you will generally get this information. I think before we were cut off, I was saying that a lot of American employers are very keen on these tests. Again, you have to apply them equally to all employees, and you have to be wary of indirect discrimination. But I mean, that's where, you've got a requirement set up, and a particular category of person, say a person with a particular mental illness, anyone in that category is disproportionately excluded from meeting the requirements. But if you can then establish that your requirement relates to the job, it's tied to the job, the requirements of the job, then you'll have an argument that, it's not actually indirect discrimination, because it is about job performance. I hope that makes sense very quickly.
Thank you. Yes, it does. I think Raj was in the middle of a point when we interrupted him to bring Dr. Carabetta back in. Raj, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay. You were making a point there.
So it was just in terms of what the Dr. Carabetta was saying, that in terms of when it comes to hiring people with disabilities, there are usually a lot of companies do have two different standards. One is for a person like during an application time where they can click off, I do not have any types of disability. I do not need any support structures set up for my interview or for the application process.
Yep.
Versus the one where if they click, okay, I do have a form of disability and I need help with, then the application processes vary. Like couple of the companies that we do work alongside with, like the standardized application is anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. But then you can also take into factor and appreciate that a person with disability, it could be mental health, it could be intellectual. They will not sit behind the computer for over an hour putting an application in. And that is where it opens the conversation around diversity and inclusion as to how to include the specific demography of candidates to actually be successful in this type of roles.
Sure. Yeah, we had the same, Raj, great point. We had the same issue with, well, not the same issue, the same challenge, I should say, with students, for example. That's fantastic, yeah.
Because as I was telling the whole group of people that are on the WebEx, on this meeting today, that this is what I do on a day-to-day basis for the company that I work with, where we go into organizations, see how their recruitment process are and how to make it a lot more inclusive. This is something which we provide free of cost for companies to ensure that they are within the guidelines, because every organization in Australia, big or small or medium, needs to have a certain percentage of people with a diverse and inclusive background. So that's where we come in to basically say, hey, it's the process of interviewing, of hiring isn't daunting, because we work alongside with organizations from the screening process to finding the candidates to helping them with applications, as well as providing support once they start employment. And it's not like as soon as they started employment, you're on your own, we don't want to know about you. We provide that support to the candidate as well as to the employers. So,
and what's the organisation, Raj?
The company that I work for is Disability Services Australia. We are part of Scope, which is a Victorian-based company. We've got offices in Sydney, in Campbelltown, Blacktown, Bankstown, Kingsgrove, and Mascot. So, like I said, if anyone on this or on this WebEx or any company that you are aware of that needs this kind of support to hire people with mental health or to hire people with disability or from a diverse background, please reach out and I'll make sure that we can get something done for your organizations.
Thanks very much again, Raj.
My hand is up, Rob. So please send me Raj's details.
I will, thank you, yes. Edwina, we asked you for closing comments about 10 minutes ago, and I think we're going to finish now with Edwina. We're about 5 minutes over time. Over to you.
I think in terms of closing remarks, I think the trends-wise, we'll increasingly see mental health being further and further embedded in everyone's vernacular. So I would certainly encourage for everybody to really go about learning more about mental health, about psychology. It's truly illuminating, really, really interesting. Not only, I think, does it support yourself, but also the people around you and your teams. But if you do need any support around that, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Rob, Actevate. We'd be more than happy to help.
Thanks very much to Dr. Carabetta for joining us. Again, we're very sorry about those technical issues. Thank you everyone for joining our session this morning. We will have a recording of the session if you would like to revisit it again, and Kat will provide that to all the participants. Thanks very much for joining us again, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Bye for now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Scott.